We have learned a lot so far. Joins are a crux of any good query that spans across your database, and you're going to be using it very, very, very often. Now, for visualizations of data, joins become very important. But what if you wanted to run analytical data? Well, Mo, you taught us that there's some average count. We can pretty much make anything of our data. And that's true. But what if I were to ask you the question, what if you wanted to do that on department basis? What if you wanted to group your data into logical groups, let's say by department, by salary category, by gender? There's all different types of ways of grouping data. And I'm alluding to something here. There's a keyword, a new one we're learning, and we're going to supercharge our knowledge of SQL with this one. This is going to be something that unlocks so many avenues for us. Group by. Group by is a keyword that is used to summarize or aggregate data by groups. Grouping data into logical buckets allows us to operate against those buckets individually. Now, the question is, why would you group data? And the answer is to get in-depth information by group. We want to get that in-depth knowledge, that specific information by that group. Again, for instance, by department, the salaries by department, or the amount of employees by department, or the total amount of salaries paid by department. There are many different avenues we can walk that a business manager would come up to you and say, hey, I really need to know this thing. I really need to know it by department or by start date, like grouping them by like year of start. When did we hire the most expensive employees, etc., etc. There are many different questions that you can answer when needing to group data. So what if we wanted to know how many employees worked in each department? That's the question we've been alluding to this entire time. What if we wanted to know that? How would we do that? Well, that's a big question mark, right? Like, it's confusing. We haven't seen this group by thing yet. How does it work? What does it look like? Well, right now, how we would think of it in our head, the mental model, you would be like, hey, Mo, I'm just going to select the department number, and then I'm going to count the employee number from department employee. Then I know how many employees are by the department, right? Let's try that out. So if I were to say select department number, count employee number, and we did that from department employee, well, let's see what happens. It explodes right in our face. And the error is column department number must appear in a group by clause or be used in an aggregate function. What? Okay, well, let's go back to our slides real quick. Now, didn't we learn that sum, min, max, count, etc. return one record? They like aggregate data, right? So if they're returning one record, what's the group by for? Why is it complaining about this group by? Well, as you could see by the error, it's telling us, hey, if you want to do this, you need to group this data by this column. So group by splits data into groups or chunks so we can apply functions against a group rather than the entire table. Now let's take a look at what that looks like. So over here, we're back at our error. And it's saying, hey, department number must appear in a group by clause. And we learned that count, sum, min, max, they return one record. So when we run this, okay, we're getting the total amount of employees. We know how many employees work for the company. But now we want to know by department. And when we execute this, it blows up in our face, right? Now, if we followed what it said, group by, and we said department number. Okay. I follow. The group by is this new keyword that we're putting at the bottom. And it's going to group the data into chunks by department number. So every department is going to become a group. So it's going to go look at every single group. So let's select department number, for instance, and let's just quickly comment this out. We look at this and we know that, okay, we have D5, D7. Let's quickly order this because order by department number. And so what we can see here is a lot of employees work for Department 1, Department 5, Department 7, because this is department employees, remember? We're getting a record of each department number per employee. So if we group these by department number, what we're going to see is that, okay, we're getting groups. So D1, D2, D3. Interesting. So it grouped the data. It took every single department and it grouped it by the department number. So every single employee that was in Department 1 is now in this logical group, right? Think about it this way. What we basically did is we said, hey, group it by the department number. So every time I find D001, which is unique, just put that record in that bucket. And so what do I mean by put that record in that bucket? Well, now, if we said employee number, what's going to happen is it's going to complain to us. It's going to say, hey, you grouped by department number. What are you trying to do here? This is your group. This doesn't belong to your group. You can't just go ahead and say visualize this because our groups are by department number. Now, if I added employee number to this, what we're going to see is that now the group is by department number and employee number. So it's not really going to be very granular anymore. We're going to get all of those D1s again and D2s again, and we're going to see every employee number. So our group now explodes back out to what it originally is. That's not what we want to do. When we have this logical group and this explodes, what we're basically doing here, and what is the power of group by, is when we create these groups, the purpose of it is to run functions against some other part of the data. We want to run a function. So if we said, hey, count this. Well, if we count employee number, now we suddenly know, hey, how many employees are in each department? How many? And now we suddenly know this. We know that 20,000 employees are in Department 1, 17,000 are in Department 2, etc., etc., etc. So group by splits data into groups or chunks so we can apply functions against the group rather than the entire table. Because as you remember, when we ran functions, we were running functions to get a single answer, a single return value. If we counted employee number, we get the total number of employee numbers. So group by allows us to chunk the data into groups so we can apply the function against a group. We use group by exclusively or almost exclusively with the aggregate functions with sum, min, max, count, etc., etc. Now, why? Because when we get a group of data, we often want to know something about that group. And that something we want to know is most likely a count, a sum, a min, a max, whatever the case is. You wanted to know the highest salary in that group. You wanted to know the amount of employees in that group. There's many questions you can ask here. When we group by, we apply the function per group. This is very important conceptually to remember. When we group by, we apply the function per group, not the entire data set. So remember, when we used to apply sum, min, max, count, it was against the entire data table. It was against every single row. But when we group by, we're applying the function against that group, the group by department number, for instance. So this was our answer. Select department number, count employee number, and we're grouping by the department number. We're creating those logical groups, those unique groups. Group by is stricter than it looks. You have to remember this. Now, we just saw how powerful this can be. We just saw, hey, I can group stuff. But there's some things that we need to remember, and that is that group by is stricter than it looks. Every column not in the group by clause must apply a function. And that's what we saw when we did comma employee number. It exploded in our face, right? Let's take a look at that again. When we went over here and we didn't apply this count, oh boy, was it mad. Column employee number must appear in the group by clause or be used by an aggregate function. So it's telling us what to do. It's telling us specifically what we should be doing with this. Errors are always useful like this. So It's telling us, hey, either put this in your group by or apply a function to it. Group by is stricter than it looks. Now, why? Well, group by is there to reduce all records found for the matching group to a single record. So when we create this group, it's going to boil that group down to a single record. It's to run that analytical and aggregate function against that group. What we basically are saying is, hey, we have all of this data and there are all these kinds of duplicates in here. And I want to run this calculation against this group. I want to know an output for this group. So it's going to boil down the group to a single record. And we can run analytical functions against different parts of it. We can say, hey, count the amount of employees. Get me the max salary number. Anything you want to show after the group has to boil down to one record. Anything after department number, for instance, like we saw, either has to use an aggregate function to boil itself down to one result, to a singular result, or it needs to become part of the grouping. It has to create that new unique group. So you may be asking yourself, okay, well, how does this group by work? Because we're creating these groups, but what's actually happening here? Well, group by utilizes something called a split, apply, combine strategy. It's going to split, apply, and combine. So let's take a look at that. Split, apply, and combine looks something like this. You have a data set of records, and we have 2 A's, 2 B's, 2 C's. And we're saying, hey, the groups are by X. So if we're grouping by X, we're going to split out X, the unique groups of X. So A, B, and C. So now that we know the unique groups, well then we're going to apply something to it. So we apply an aggregate function to Y. That's what we're doing. So we split out the groups A, B, B, C, C. We apply some kind of aggregate function to Y. And then we combine the outputs to get the groups with the singular output. A equals 3, B equals 2.5, C equals 7.5. Split, apply, combine. We split by the groups. We apply the aggregate functions to the remaining columns, to the columns we specified that need to apply an aggregate function. And then we combine the results to gain the output. So split, divide into groups with values. Apply. Apply aggregate against ungrouped columns, the ones that we specify. The combine phase combines groups with a single value into a single value. Now, what does this one mean? Well, the combine phase is going to say, hey, I have this group A, I have this group B, I have this group C, and I have all of these things I applied an aggregate function to that also outputted a single value. And now I'm going to visualize group value, group value, group value. Kind of like we saw over here. Group value, group value, group value. And the value is a single output of Y. The group is a single value of X. So earlier in the course, we looked at the order of operations. And the order of operations is the order in which SQL does something. And what we can see here is that we're doing from, where, group by, select, and then at the end we order data. So something to note here is group by came in the middle. What just happened here? Well, group by happens after the where clause and the from clause. So if you have a where clause, the group by has to come after it. If you don't have a where clause, it has to come after the from clause. And then if we look at what happens after you do the groups, that's when we do our select. And that's when we do our ordering. So the order of operations is important to know because you need to know where to put your group by clause. If you accidentally put it before your where, well then weird things are going to happen. It's going to complain to you. It's going to say, hey, this needs to come after. And so with all of that said, let's jump into some exercises that we can do around group by to flex those muscles.